Hello, everyone, and welcome to the December 7th edition of our Limnos seminar. I am Alex, and today we welcome Dr. Andrea Kirkwood from the University of Ontario Institute of Technology. Andrea completed an undergrad degree in Environmental and Resource Studies and Biology at the University of Waterloo. She holds a master's degree in aquatic ecology from McMaster, where she was interested in mercury accumulation in phytoplankton and the effect of whole lake biomanipulation on algal community structure. Andrea's PhD was performed at the University of Toronto, and her work focused on the ecophysiological role of cyanobacteria in pulp and paper waste treatment systems. Andrea is an associate professor at the University of Ontario Institute of Technology, and she will be talking to us about urban ecology. And Andrea, the floor is yours. You may be able to share your screen now.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming, even though it's virtual. It's my pleasure to give a talk today on some of the work we've done in my lab over the last few years. Urban ecology, I think right now, just from my impression from Twitter, is becoming more and more popular, and there's more interest. I just saw a tweet the other day. I think it was Jennifer Tank had tweeted about urban aquatic ecosystems aren't dysfunctional, but in fact, they're the new normal. And so I think this is kind of a nice segue into the webinar I'm giving today. So as you can see with my title, I would like to perhaps change some views about how we perceive urban surface waters to be, rather than just being kind of very degraded and dysfunctional systems, that perhaps we should look a little bit deeper to see what sorts of functions they can. I hear some background there. I don't know, someone needs to mute their computer. Okay, so we'll keep going here. There, the background seems to be stopping that little hissing sound. But okay, so my question is, why should we care about aquatic ecosystems in urbanizing areas? And so here you can see a picture of normally when I have an audience, I ask people if they know where this is, but I'll have to tell you all that this is Lake Ontario. And you can see here that this is Toronto, and then we have Ajax, and then we have Whitby and Oshawa and Bowmanville over here. And as you can see, there's urban areas here and culture here. And so in most cases, people, when they think of urban ecosystems, they just think of basically paved over environments where any surface waters, whether it be ponds or creeks or wetlands, are pretty impoverished from urban activities. And so they just kind of write them off. Well, I'm hoping to be able to convince you today that, in fact, we should probably be thinking about these systems as very dynamic and perhaps functional, not functional to the level of natural systems, but certainly well adapted to the environments that they've really, the impacts that they've, sorry, that background hissing is really distracting. But I'll try and persevere and keep going. Okay. I think someone needs to mute their background. Okay, so urbanization in Canada. Well, and this is true really for much of the developed world, where people are moving from rural regions to urban populations. And so the statistics for Canada, at least in 2010, were that most Canadians live in urban areas. So that's 81% of our total population. Now the rate of urbanization is expected to actually increase. So there will be growth of urban development that's expected, and these statistics are a little bit dated now, but certainly this annual rate of increase is expected to continue into the near future. So what that means is that most of us live in urban areas, and so because we live in urban areas, we should be considerate about, or concerned at least, about the aquatic systems that, and on all ecosystems that we're living near and have influence on. Okay, now I don't hear that background noise anymore, so that's good. Hopefully I can focus now. Okay, so this brings up this notion of ecosystem services, which is, really a very exciting area of research. And it's more or less, for those of you who aren't familiar with the term of ecosystem services, it's acknowledging that healthy ecosystems, whether they be terrestrial or aquatic, when they're functioning, optimally, they actually provide us services that, you can literally put a dollar value to if you were to determine, what function and what utilitarian service that they're providing to society. So this could be provisioning of goods, regulating the environment that we live in, as well as the cultural benefits. So I'm just going to draw your attention really to water purification here, because ultimately fresh water, and of course fresh water is important as a drinking water source, but aquatic systems such as wetlands and even stormwater ponds may serve a role in water purification in urban areas. So this is a picture of UOIT, and UOIT is a relatively young university. I think we're going into our 14th year, but we have actually fairly new infrastructure on campus, and we have green roofs, and we have some permeable surfaces to allow infiltration of rainwater, and we also have stormwater ponds. And so if you just want to look at the stormwater pond as just an example of an urban aquatic system, it could be an urban creek, it could be an urban wetland. And because there's water here, and I'm an aquatic ecologist, I always look at aquatic systems that are at least not too ephemeral as having life in them. And because I focus on algae and bacteria, I know that there's going to be aquatic life in these types of systems. And because there's aquatic life in these systems, there's going to be a certain level of diversity and function associated with the types of organisms that live in these aquatic systems. Now, conventionally, we think about stressors and multiple stressors from urbanization, and whether that's just development activities, whether that's turning natural areas into paved and impermeable surfaces. And this has an effect on the diversity and function of aquatic ecosystems, which ultimately, begs the question, well, could they even pose or offer any ecosystem services because of the impact of the stressors causing impairments in aquatic diversity and function? Now that's kind of an accepted view of these systems, but in the last few years, I think, and it's not just me, I think a lot of aquatic ecologists who study urban systems recognize that we have to actually do a deeper dive here and try and understand these systems that perhaps they may not have as many species represented, but certainly because they've adapted to these types of stresses that impact the diversity and function, that perhaps they could have a mediating effect on the stressors from urbanization. And of course, this is fairly limited, and my own personal research interest is really looking at diversity and function and the role it plays in mediating and even attenuating contaminants that are an important stressor from urbanization. And I'll talk more about that shortly. And so with having this potential mediating or attenuating effect on these stressors, is this in fact an ecosystem service that aquatic ecosystems can provide? And this, in this talk, I'll be focusing on urban wetlands and stormwater ponds, but certainly I think it could be broader, and even thinking about urban creeks. And because I know in many systems, and of course there'll be thresholds with how much biomass can be supported, but some urban creeks can be very productive. And with that productivity, there could be associated kind of what I would call a contaminant scrubbing that may occur longitudinally along a creek system. So in the long term, really, my lab is interested in trying to understand how external and internal drivers of diversity and function in these urban aquatic systems ultimately impact surface water quality, because that's really what municipalities and the users of surface waters, whether it's for drinking water, whether it's for recreational water, water quality, of course, is greatly impacted by urbanization. And so if we can look to the ecosystems themselves that house these urban surface waters, be it creeks, stormwater ponds, or wetlands, perhaps we can, if we understand them better, we can see and perhaps optimize the role that they can play as an important ecosystem service in urban areas. So what I mean by external and internal drivers really is based on what's happening outside of the aquatic ecosystem and what's happening inside. So externally, so here you have, say this is an urban creek, you have external factors related to climate, so precipitation and temperature, solar radiation. You have land cover and land use and topography, but you also have the influence of soils and geology, so the physiography of the watershed, and all of these components can influence the water quality in this creek because of, after a rain event, and even with just general wind transport of whether it's phosphorus or other contaminants, they enter the surface water. And so what happens to those contaminants and those nutrients and so forth as they're transferred from upstream to downstream is of interest. And so internally, so this is a picture of a pond, but certainly you can think of internal processes happening in urban creeks as well. But internal processes that are important are really the organisms that grow. So you can have autochthonous growth of algae bringing energy into the system, and decomposition processes. You have internal cycling of nutrients. And you also have food webs. And for those of you who are familiar with stormwater ponds, they do receive urban runoff, but some of these ponds can be very productive. Unfortunately, people dump their goldfish in these ponds, and so they can become overrun with goldfish. But overall, these ponds are very productive. And with that, we know that there's going to be very dynamic internal processing in these ponds. So when we think of urbanization, one of the major impacts of urbanization, in addition to several factors, is it's really this conversion of terrestrial surfaces from surfaces that have a fair amount of infiltration. So when there's a rain event, water in natural areas can infiltrate the soil and actually reach the groundwater for deep infiltration. Whereas when you have this type of landscape converted to an urban landscape where you have roads and buildings, all hard surfaces that are impermeable, you can see that we change the fate of water and where it goes and how fast it runs off of the landscape. And so really the impacts of this there's kind of two fundamental impacts. One is erosion, because the water is not able to infiltrate very easily. It's forced to build up and flow, and there's a higher energy associated with that. And so you have higher erosion rates that occur in urban areas, as well as infiltration. So erosion increases and infiltration decreases, and that influences the water quantity that is running off the landscape and into aquatic ecosystems. So this can cause problems such as flash flooding. We've seen this in Toronto and other areas where local waterways become inundated with water and flood over into their natural floodplains. Shear stress and bed movement, so that's changing the geomorphology of these systems. And what we're particularly interested in my lab is water quality. So certainly an increase in turbidity, nutrients, increase in nutrients, the types of nutrients and transport of nutrients, as well as contaminants, ranging from metals such as copper and zinc, and even lead and chromium and so forth that are associated with various both urban and industrial activities. And so this is where we're pretty much going to focus on in today's talk. So this is a picture of the town of Ajax. I forget how old it is now. I'm sure it's probably at least a decade. But what it does is a really nice depiction of a lot of suburban or residential development that happens, but also industrial development, and an increase in impervious surface. And I would actually argue that even nicely manicured lawns contribute to imperviousness. Now, they're not completely impervious, but there have been studies showing that lawns, especially lawns that are in compacted soil, can be almost, not quite, but almost as impervious as asphalt. And so here you can see a kind of a freshwater, well, it's a channelized creek. This is Duffins Creek coming in here, and you have water that's being released into the lake, and you can see it's very turbid. And this is after a storm event that probably happened within the last 24 hours. And visually, you can see the effect it has on water quality. So you see this plume of turbidity entering the lake and kind of hugging the coastline. And so kind of the fundamental question that we're asking is if there is a role for urban aquatic ecosystems in attenuating stormwater runoff. And so visually we can see turbidity is quite high, but there are other things, as I'd mentioned, nutrients and contaminants that are associated with this urban runoff. So I'd mentioned that term ecosystem services, and really I want to tie in this kind of role of kind of functioning urban aquatic ecosystems and how their function can contribute to ecosystem services in urban areas. And so this is a diagram that I borrowed from the Central Lake Ontario Conservation Authority because their primary mandate is to focus on source water protection. Because ultimately, when we think about the drinking water that we have, it goes through a series of steps from testing, distribution, to treatment, to ultimately the original water source. So for those of us who live on the shores of Lake Ontario, we get our drinking water from Lake Ontario. But it's these tributaries, including the tributaries that we study in my lab, that actually flow into Lake Ontario. And so how these aquatic systems, whether they be creeks and stormwater ponds and urban wetlands, function, because ultimately they all drain into Lake Ontario, is really another way of looking at it is the type of ecosystem service they could provide to improve water quality at this end, to make things easier downstream. So make it even a bit cheaper and easier to treat the water if we can at least try and maintain water quality at this at the very beginning in source water protection. So what are the types of things that potentially urban wetlands and stormwater management ponds could do? Well, clarification is certainly an important physical process. And in fact, stormwater management ponds have been designed primarily for hydrological control of water, as well as for allowing sedimentation to occur. And so just with sedimentation alone, water quality can be greatly improved. Now, filtration, we usually think about wetlands as being very important as filters of water. So as water passes through a wetland, particulates get trapped in the vegetation, and microbes or microbial activities are important in mineralizing organic contaminants and even trapping other contaminants such as metals in the sediments. Now, purification, which I guess I really touched on already with microbial activities, but purification can be a matter of just adsorption or absorption of certain contaminants onto sediment particles in whether it's urban wetlands or stormwater management ponds. They can be taken up by plants and microbes, and then they can be biodegraded. Largely, biodegradation is being done by heterotrophic bacteria in these systems. Okay, so the first project we did in my lab, this is my first graduate student, Nick Gilbert, and we wanted to look at urban wetlands. And in fact, this was Nick's actual interest. He was really interested in urban wetlands around where he lives. And so he's able to do a very local study. And so the wetlands that we chose were very, very similar. Had shared, they're in distinct sub-watersheds, but they are very geographically very close to one another. But the one defining feature between them was that they had different contaminant histories. So they were all kind of cattail dominated urban wetlands, within the boundaries of Oshawa and Whitby, and mostly residential areas. So we were able to find one remnant wetland that's actually protected now by the Conservation Authority in North Whitby, and historically contaminated remnant wetland, which received leachate from an old landfill site that GM used from the 1950s into the 1970s to dump everything from solvents, oils, and metal, and just old waste metals and so forth. So a whole hodgepodge of waste. And we know that it was very high at one point in metals, particularly copper and iron and zinc, but certainly organics as well. And then finally, a mature constructed wetland. So I would call this constructed wetland kind of a early version of a stormwater pond. So it's about 30 years old in a residential subdivision that now is basically being filled in with cattails. Okay, so Nick went out and he sampled the sediment. He took cores along transects. So he took multiple samples within these wetlands in spring, summer, and fall in order to get an idea of heterogeneity across these wetlands and temporally over the season. So just to give you some context of where this is happening, here's the Great Lakes Basin, and here's Oshawa Whitby here. And this is just a map just showing you how close these wetlands actually are, but they are in distinct subwatersheds. And so this is what the remnant wetland looks like. This is what the contaminated remnant wetland looks like. And this is what the constructed wetland looks like. So very similar with respect to being dominated by very similar vegetation, but obviously different hydrology as well as contaminant histories. Okay, so I realize I probably should have went to the trouble of making a nicer table, but I ripped this out of Nick's paper, and because I wanted to show that overall these wetlands are very similar with respect to physical structure, and as well as other chemical parameters, so such as pH, moisture, and organic matter. Although their averages look quite different, but overall, because of the variation across these wetlands and the heterogeneity in these wetlands, they weren't statistically different, with the exception of salinity. So the constructed wetland, which is designed to receive road runoff, because it is really an earlier design version of what we would call now a stormwater pond, it does have significantly higher. And what was really interesting is that salinity was consistently high across whether it's spring, summer, or fall. And so that's important to know, because we know that salinity can distinguish microbial communities, and that may play a role in why we see certain differences in the constructed wetland and when we looked at microbial diversity in these systems. And so Nick was able to just, first of all, let's just compare, their community level physiological profile. So using biolog ecoplates, which have 32 different substrates, natural substrates you'd find in various ecosystems. And he was able to compare, and so each line basically represents a subsample from each wetland at different times, but they're all kind of matched the same time points. And really what I want to draw your attention to is that there's a lot of physiological diversity that we can see, because basically each sample was distinct, or each replicate sample was distinct, but certainly the constructed wetland physiologically stood out. And so the contaminated remnant wetland and the remnant wetland, it seemed that all of the samples from those wetlands kind of intermingled, but we saw a fairly distinct physiological profile for the constructed wetland, which perhaps may be due to the higher salinity. But then when you look at 16S ribosomal RNA that was amplified and analyzed with DGGE, you can see that, in fact, the remnant wetland and the constructed wetland tended to cluster more together, obviously with some variation, and the contaminated remnant wetland was tended to cluster together. Now, with respect to diversity, the diversity is fairly comparable to other kind of urban wetland systems, so relatively low diversity compared to, say, natural wetland systems. And so this is another table from Nick's paper that is really this analysis. This is basically looking at a dose response effect of copper sulfate on microbial communities in these urban wetland sediment communities. And what we were really more interested in was looking at tolerance, so resilience of these microbial communities, because we know that copper is a very significant urban pollutant. And I'll show you in future, in the slides in the next section that I talk about, that copper is indeed really elevated in urban surface water runoff. So if you look at the constructed wetland, the contaminated remnant wetland, and the remnant wetland, the EC50s are really high. So these are well above what we'd see in kind of background environmental concentrations. But what I want you to focus in on is that the contaminated remnant wetland really has very elevated tolerance to copper compared to the other wetlands. And so, and you see this too with the inhibition at the highest copper sulfate concentration, it was extremely high. Now keep in mind, these are sediment communities, so the sediments, the ligands in the sediments are going to play an important role in reducing the toxic effect or the bioavailability of copper. But, you know, even so, being able to compare the relative effects, you can see that the contaminated remnant wetland is a lot more tolerant to copper than the other wetlands. And this may be due to the different contaminant history, where we know that copper and other metals were leaching from that old landfill site. So that's looking at tolerance. Well, this graph, we looked at both 2,4-D, dichlorophenoxyacetic acid, which is a herbicide, that there's a legacy of application in the watersheds, although now in Ontario, you know, cosmetic use of pesticides in general has been banned. We also looked at chlorobenzoate because it's kind of a model chlorinated organic compound. And these compounds, because they're soluble, they're kind of easier to work with at this point. But we thought they were still reflective of, you know, this legacy of pesticide or herbicide use in the watersheds. And what you can see from this is that, and this is based on radioisotope labeled 2,4-D. We also did this for chlorobenzoate as well, with very similar results. And you can see that it takes a good 21 days for the remnant wetland, in fact, to have the highest efficiency of removal of 2,4-D from the experimental samples. And so from this, what you can take, yes, this is, you know, done in the lab, and it's not reflecting kind of in situ conditions, but under controlled conditions, it is apparent that the remnant wetland has a higher capacity for biodegradation for 2,4-D than the other wetlands. But based on the time that the time period required, and we know that the hydrological residence time for waters, especially after storm event, is much shorter than 21 days. It doesn't really suggest that these urban wetlands can function in a highly effective or efficient manner to remove these types of chlorinated organics from water that's passing through these systems and draining into local creeks. Okay, so moving on to stormwater management ponds. This is I wouldn't say this is a typical one. This is a kind of a large one that you would typically see in an industrial area where there's lots of kind of parking lot space. And so relatively large ponds are used for drainage of these types of commercial industrial areas. And if you can note, you know, very productive. There's a floating scum of algae there. You can see that there's aquatic macrophytes that are growing quite well in this pond. So, you know, very productive systems. You would never say that, you know, it's stormwater ponds are dead or don't have a lot going on internally. So just to remind those who are perhaps sitting in just wanting to learn a little bit more about urban aquatic systems, and stormwater management ponds are engineered systems. So they are a best management practice for now. I'm sure things will change in the next decade or so, but for now they're a common best management practice for urban runoff stormwater management. Okay, so they're designed to reduce downstream flooding, so really to capture runoff and to hold it and allow kind of a much slower kind of drainage into local receiving waters, such as urban creeks in our area. And they're also recognized for water quality management and really the physical settling of particulates to allow sedimentation of both particulates and contaminants that are absorbed onto those particulates. So indeed, this has been shown to be important for water quality improvement. And just in the Greater Toronto area alone, there are hundreds. And I know in many urban and urbanizing areas, stormwater management ponds are still the standard practice. When there's new developments, there's typically stormwater management ponds that are part of the kind of the blueprint for new communities and new, whether it's new subdivisions or new commercial areas. So another way to look at stormwater management ponds is that they really can serve to be an important land-water linkage. And so this picture here is taken, for those of you who are familiar with Calgary, in the south end of Calgary. Here's Fish Creek. So here's Fish Creek Provincial Park. And you'll see that it looks like they're still under construction, but there's been some stormwater management ponds that have been engineered here, and then there's the draining residential subdivision. So basically water draining off from this these subdivisions, this residential area will enter the stormwater ponds, and then with after some sedimentation, water eventually will infiltrate, or at least flow down into Fish Creek. And so really it's a nice picture of how stormwater ponds can be these mediation zones. So you have, you know, the runoff happening here, the water being captured here, and at least from a physical perspective, they're being sedimented out, and then the water that's entering the creek is in theory supposed to be cleaner. And so part of that kind of the treatment of the water, if you will, is really reducing particulates and nutrients and contaminants that are associated with the particulates. So we have a good understanding of, you know, kind of the engineering side of things of stormwater ponds, that they function very well for containing water and for even improving water quality of that collected water before it enters natural waterways such as creeks. But there's also little known about the internal processing in SMPs, especially under changing temperature and redox conditions. Now, certainly I wouldn't say there's nothing known, because there are groups, even just down the road from here at Trent University, Paul Frost and Maggie Xenopoulos' labs have looked at stormwater ponds and have done some great work looking at stoichiometry and nutrient cycling in these systems. It's important to understand what's happening inside these ponds, because ultimately the water is going to enter receiving waters. And so if you can understand more of what's happening here, and because we know there's a lot of biological activity that happens in these ponds, we can perhaps improve our understanding of how nutrients are being processed, how contaminants are being processed, whether it's through biodegradation or even biotransformation, changing contaminants via microbial activities. And so the very first step that my lab did with my two undergraduate students here, and Jennifer Vincent here, we ended up publishing a paper from this work, and she went on to Paul Frost and Maggie Xenopoulos' labs to be a graduate student that worked in the Experimental Lakes area. And so for her fourth year honors project, she, with help from another student, Courtney, looked at characterizing the water quality and biological communities of SMPs, just to get an idea of overall variation in phytoplankton community structure as well as water quality aspects, and also to assess the capacity for SMPs to mediate water quality and contaminants. So this was another student, Carrie Strangway. She looked at aspects of this, and I'll provide, I'll show some data, preliminary data from that work as well. But you'll see from this map, so here's Lake Ontario, and here's really Ajax, Whitby, Oshawa. And you'll notice that there's this big hole right here. Why didn't we look at ponds here? Well, for the most part, from probably about here down, is old infrastructure. This is the city of Oshawa, and Oshawa's history is related to the GM plant, so car manufacturing. So lots of kind of industrial urban activities were happening here over the last even 100 years. So you can see these green strips. These are creeks, and Oshawa Creek and different branches of Oshawa Creek. There's Oshawa Creek yes, this is Oshawa Creek flowing into the harbor here. Well, storm sewers. So basically, water is, in older areas, you don't have the kind of mediation effect of stormwater ponds. You just have direct runoff going into creeks. So fortunately, with AJAX, we were able to get kind of a longitudinal look at a watershed, stormwater ponds throughout different watersheds. We were able to capture 4 different watersheds. And you can see these yellow markers are depicting what we call reference ponds. So fortunately, we were able to get, in order to kind of compare stormwater ponds, it's good to compare them amongst each other, but to compare them to say what a natural, so a non-engineered pond system, and there's ponds in conservation areas. So this is Heber Down Pond and Enniskillen Conservation Area. There's 2 ponds that are actually, at each end of the conservation area, so not directly beside each other. And so just to give you an idea of how we selected our ponds, we wanted to capture a vegetation gradient. And so obviously a vegetation gradient is very much associated with the age of the pond. So new ponds are pretty much devoid of any vegetation. So we're able to capture a few of those in our total of 22 stormwater ponds that we sampled from. And then you have, these older ponds here where they're starting to get infilled with emergent vegetation. So this is what one of our reference ponds looks like. So in size, they're relatively, there was a range of sizes of stormwater ponds and reference ponds, but they're all pretty much within the same order of magnitude. So from that perspective, they're fairly comparable. Of course, the reference ponds would be influenced by agricultural activity, but what makes them distinguished, or they're distinguished from stormwater ponds, is that they don't have any urban influence. They're surrounded by forested areas as well as being in and agriculturally dominated watersheds. So we were able to get some data from CLOCA, who went to the trouble of determining the amount of impervious surface area in each of the watersheds that our stormwater ponds were in. So this is just an example of the Oshawa Creek watershed, and you can see that they've been able to, dark areas represent, high percentages of impervious surface relative to lower, and then virtually none up in the headwaters of Oshawa Creek. And so interestingly enough, even though this was based on a kind of a subset of data, so smaller, relatively small sample size, I believe the sample size was 12, we were able to use 12 ponds, and comparing that to the determined impervious surface area that these ponds were situated in, and we found statistically significant relationships between, basically the usual suspects. So conductivity, total suspended solids, and chloride, all, especially chloride, covaried with impervious surface area quite strongly, in fact. So this has been found in other studies, and so it shows how important impervious surface area is to driving water quality in stormwater ponds. Now this is a canonical correspondence analysis where the phytoplankton community was assessed in all of the ponds. And this is actually an average, based on a seasonal average, as well as the water quality parameters. Now, if we recall, so we have a pretty decent vegetation gradient. We're able to capture that. And in fact, we found that there was a significant relationship where the more vegetation in a pond, the lower the temperature. So there was a kind of a cooling effect of vegetation. But when we looked at the effect of vegetation cover on all of the other water quality variables, there were no statistically significant relationships at all. And even just looking at scatter plots, there was nothing, no relationships that were obvious. And so that was very interesting finding, because one would think that the more vegetation there would be in a pond, perhaps the more of a filtering or even biological interaction with the organic matter from plants and the microbes would make it easier for the microbes to break down contaminants and so forth, but or at least process nutrients, and we didn't find any of that in our analyses. Now, when you're looking at this ellipse here is not statistical in any way. It's just really to demarcate how different the reference ponds, at least 2 out of the 3, are very different. They're dominated by dinoflagellates. They tend to be, well, at least one of them is more of a kind of a tea stain, has a lot of dissolved organic matter in it. But I want to draw your attention to this mess down here. And what you can see is BG standing for blue-green algae or cyanobacteria. And most of the ponds were very similar with respect to community structure, at least with respect to being dominated by blue-green algae. And the dominant taxon, or at least taxa, because there's probably multiple species, was Microcystis. And so this was actually very alarming because we know that Microcystis certain species of Microcystis can produce toxins. So moving on to looking at the metals, we did an analysis of a suite of metals in stormwater ponds. And as you can see, copper, chromium, lead, and zinc, they're very common urban contaminants. And I want to point out that copper, certainly at least one date, exceeded the provincial water quality guideline for copper. So copper can be very elevated in some of these stormwater ponds. And in fact, where most of these metals are the highest, have the highest concentrations, they were stormwater ponds that were adjacent to a large highway. So Highway 401, which is a very large highway in this area. And so basically what I want you to get from looking at this graph is that compared to the reference ponds, of course we only had 3 reference ponds, but certainly you can see that there's a high degree of variability among stormwater ponds with respect to different contaminant concentrations, but in all cases they're elevated and a lot higher than what you'd see in, say, a natural reference pond. So again, we looked at copper because copper is an important urban contaminant. And Carrie Strangway, another undergraduate thesis student, she looked at the tolerance, because the assumption is that if these stormwater pond communities are receiving contaminated water, that perhaps they have evolved and adapted to being able to live, or at least species have a high tolerance to certain contaminants. So we looked at copper. And just to break down what this graph is showing, well, we used fluorescence to look at the fluorescence of chlorophyll A in the community. So this is in vivo, so looking at whole cells, as well as looking at FDA. So fluorescein diacetate assay is an assay that looks at total microbial community. So this would include all microbes, both algae and bacteria. But certainly we can make inferences, since we know that algal biomass fluorescing, so those photosynthetic organisms, as copper concentration increased, as expected, we would expect algal biomass to decrease, because we know that copper in particular is toxic to algae. But what was interesting in the reference pond and also in this stormwater pond example is that at 0.1 milligrams per liter of copper, there seemed to be a shift where you can see that algal growth in both instances is declining with increasing copper concentration. But once you got to 0.1, there seems to be the stimulation of microbial activity. And so this is interesting, because what it's inferring is that depending on the concentrations of particular contaminants, you can shift microbial activity from perhaps one that's autotrophic dominated to perhaps more heterotrophic dominated. But then when we looked at other stormwater management ponds, we saw very different patterns. And in this instance, again, we're still seeing kind of a decline in algal biomass, but we're also seeing a corresponding increase in total microbial activity with increasing copper concentration. And then in this stormwater management pond, we actually see the algal community, which could be very distinct from all of the other algal communities that we looked at in the other stormwater ponds, where there seems to be a high degree of resistance. And this is not uncommon. There are certain algal taxa that develop very high tolerances to metals such as copper. So I wanted to just throw this last graph in here that Carrie made, and you look at it and think, well, it's showing nothing. Well, it's actually showing something. It's showing that over 2 weeks, the whole community, the planktonic community in the stormwater ponds, so there's 3 different stormwater ponds here and the reference ponds, we when we wanted to see the capacity for biodegradation or removal of 2,4-D, you can see that, with some evaporation occurring and concentrating effect, that there's no capacity, whether it's the reference ponds or SMPs, at least under laboratory conditions, for these communities to remove 2,4-D. And certainly 2 weeks is a long time for stormwater pond, where we know that the hydrological residence time can be as short as 18 hours. Okay, so just to sum things up, we found, at least, in both of these studies are preliminary in the sense that they're the kind of first investigations of what's happening in these urban aquatic ecosystems. And in the urban wetland studies, we found that community composition and function could be influenced by contamination history. So knowing that these urban wetlands are very close to one another, share a lot of physical characteristics that are very similar other than salinity, we still found differences between community composition and function. We did find that, particularly for the contaminated remnant wetland, that there was a high tolerance to contaminants, but that was true for all of the urban wetlands. And so that's important to know, because if these communities are going to have any sort of or at least provide any sort of ecosystem service, it's important that they're able to tolerate the stressors that they're subjected to on a daily basis. Now, again, based on these preliminary studies, we found that there was generally a low capacity for urban wetland microbial communities to biodegrade mobile chlorinated organic contaminants. So I've put in mobile chlorinated organic contaminants because that's really what 2,4-D and chlorobenzoate represent, but certainly by no means are the most important or prevalent organic contaminants. We know that polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are very important organic contaminants in urban ecosystems. They're a little bit more difficult to work with, but they're definitely on our radar now, and also focusing in on adding more wetlands to the mix, because 3 wetlands is really not enough to get enough information. Now, with respect to stormwater management ponds, we found that, the 22 ponds that we studied, that for systems that are engineered and they're supposed to function a certain way, it was quite remarkable that water quality, so not just the phytoplankton communities, but the actual water quality was highly variable amongst all of the ponds. So we really didn't find, we found some ponds that were similar, but for the most part, in general, each pond was fairly unique in its water quality profile. And we found this to be true, so spatially, so across Durham region where our study was, as well as over the sampling season, which included June, July, and August. The water quality has no significant relationship with vegetation cover in stormwater management ponds either. So really I didn't have enough time to show those data, but we had a very good coverage from 0 to 80% emergent vegetation cover. And interestingly enough, we found that vegetation, at least in our stormwater ponds, didn't really seem to play a role, or at least there's no correlation with improving water quality in the ponds. And an important finding that we're actually following up now, I have a graduate student who's looking specifically at microcystis populations in stormwater ponds, is that over the summer of this study, which was back in 2011, that microcystis was pretty much the dominant phytoplankton taxa across stormwater ponds. And then finally, planktonic microbial communities and SMPs have variable responses to copper, which I showed you there. So that's very preliminary data that we have to kind of pursue and try to understand. But really what it raises the question is that when you, and may explain why there's so much water quality variability across these ponds, is that the different concentrations of different contaminants depending on the pond will play a role in structuring different planktonic communities, whether they're kind of autotrophic or photoautotrophic dominated versus heterotrophic dominated. That remains to be seen, but I think it's worth investigating. And then, of course, and there's reasons for lacking capacity to biodegrade 2,4-D as well. And I should have mentioned as well that these communities weren't particularly highly dense communities, but certainly our focus now has moved to the sediments in stormwater ponds, because that's probably where a lot of the action's happening with respect to biodegradation. Okay, so thank you for sticking through this webinar. And before I end it, I think it's important to acknowledge all those students that played an important role in collecting the data, as well as our partner organization, the Central Lake Ontario Conservation Authority, funding support from NSERC, as well as UOIT. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea.
Thank you, Andrea. Great talk.
Thanks. I was sorry, I was so thrown off. There was some weird hissing sound that was throwing me off. It was really quite loud. So I'm sure I was kind of stumbling over my words at the beginning.
Yeah, Alex sometimes has some crazy songs, but it's okay.
Okay, the floor is open for questions. So you have two different ways of submitting your questions. Either any of you in the Hangout chat can unmute yourself and ask your question, or you can also submit your questions via the YouTube chat section. So I have one question for you, Andrea, from Charles Ramcharan. Were the limnological parameters more variable in the urban systems compared to reference? And this correlate with hydrologic inputs?
Okay, so yes, if was that limnological variables, like water quality? Yeah, yes. So they were highly variable. Now with reference sites, we only had 3 versus 22, but so that in that sense, they're not quite equally comparable. But based on the impervious surface data, and of course, there's very little impervious surface surrounding our reference sites. We did find, so from that perspective, from the kind of surface water runoff, that hydrological perspective, absolutely very important. In fact, I'd say that the strongest drivers of water quality are probably more related to these physical flows of stormwater entering the stormwater ponds and picking up turbidity, picking up contaminants, as well as chloride.
Okay. Thanks, Andrea.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So last night, Andrea, we had Bill Mitch here in Ottawa, who is known for his textbook on wetlands. And he worked in the Everglades and also looked at some issues in the watershed of Lake Erie. And one of his final remarks was about wetlands and the fact that when we construct wetland, when we have engineering involved in creating this type of new ecosystems, we often forget that sometimes it takes time for these ecosystems to start working or do the things that we would like them to do. And I was wondering, in your observations, and I know that urban wetlands are pretty new in general, do you start to see that also sometimes despite all the management or all the engineering we can put around this project, we sometimes just need to let nature does its work. And maybe it's only after 5 years that finally we see that famous decline that we hope to see, let's say, in phosphorus.
Yeah, that's actually a very important point. And I touched on it, but I didn't really spend a lot of time making the point that our vegetation gradient really is reflective of an age gradient, if you will, of the age of the ponds. So we do know that the more infilled with emergent vegetation a pond is, the older it is. And so that was actually something that we were concerned about confounding our results, because we know that if you can't control for the age of the pond, and because of that point you're making, that more mature ponds that are actually acting more like wetlands would function differently than new stormwater ponds.
Yes.
But surprisingly, that didn't come out in our analysis. I was really actually quite shocked by that. I was hoping that we'd have this beautiful effect of vegetation, but it didn't exist. And I think that's partly, I probably, and we'll have to pursue this, but I really think the overlying driver is just the force of runoff, an impervious surface runoff, and perhaps it's just beyond that threshold that these ponds can process, at least from a perspective of controlling water quality. But again, I didn't look at, I may not have looked at the right parameters, like turbidity, but I would have thought at least turbidity would have been affected, but but then again, when you have phytoplankton growing in these ponds, that's going to influence turbidity too. So I think there's still quite a bit of work to tease apart really the functional role of the plants and the functional role of the microbes and how they're interacting.
Thank you.
Okay. Let me just check for more questions.
I had a question.
Yep.
You can hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, it's Roberto. I had a question about the differences in connectivity and stuff you saw in the ponds. Now, from my commute on the western side of the GTA, I noticed that the new ponds that are being developed in some divisions, they tend to be on the periphery of the subdivision, up against a major arterial road, and sometimes the bank of the pond comes right up to the sidewalk, and other times there's like a grass median, then other times there's actually there's a large width of, I guess you could call parkland, between the arterial road and the pond. So I was wondering, any of the chemical gradients you saw, do you get any sense that any of the gradients you saw was a function of however they decided to architecturally landscape the area around the pond?
Yeah, you know what, that actually would, we really should kind of look at more of, rather than just looking at kind of the broad land use aspects like urban or residential versus commercial, or impervious surface, I think that probably would be kind of a more detailed analysis to see if we could group our ponds into differences that way, to see. So I don't know, we haven't looked at that, but I can say there's definitely a strong signal that where ponds were adjacent to major arterial roads and highways, like Highway 401, the one that was near Highway 401, it was just, we had other PCAs of water quality, and it always stood off on its own. It was very contaminated with metals particularly. So there's definitely differences depending on, what these ponds, where the surface water is coming from to these ponds.
Thanks.
Thanks, Roberto. Shal has another question. Andrea, Toronto is going to be building an artificial pond system down in the new waterfront park. Any advice for them to get it right?
Well, I'm certainly not an expert. I'm sure there's people out there who are far more expert than I am. And in fact, I know there are. But just from my own kind of rudimentary education in this area over the last few years, I would say that certainly building in artificial, like constructed wetlands, ponds, having kind of a flow-through system of multiple ponds, and really design them so that it's slowing down the flow. When you slow down the flow, you're allowing for sedimentation, but you're also allowing for biological processing. So by the time, it's very similar, because I did my PhD in biological wastewater treatment. So I understand that you need a residence time, and so if for aesthetics, it's kind of nice, it attracts wildlife and so forth. But at the same time, you want to make sure that the inflowing water isn't highly contaminated, that's going to impact wildlife. But certainly, I think that having kind of that natural, tertiary type of system where it's designed to treat the water as well as have an aesthetic aspect is probably a good thing. But with respect to designing it, I'm not an expert.
Thanks, Andrea. I do have a question. In Ottawa here, we've been working with the city and a couple of colleagues in engineering and biology about the issue of hydrogen sulfide generation in some of those ponds. And I'm just curious to see how much H2S production is an issue for some of the systems you're working with.
That's interesting. That hasn't really come up. I imagine, because there's some stormwater ponds that are fairly deep, and when I say fairly deep, they're 1.5 to, I think, even 2 meters deep, which is pretty deep for a stormwater pond. So I imagine that the deeper the pond, we do know that the deeper ponds can stratify. So that's something that Paula Frost's group was able to show, because there's always this, from an engineering perspective, it was just assumed that these are well mixed. The residence time is short, so stratification can never really happen. But in fact, Paul Frost's group was able to show that there is stratification. So with stratification, we know that the sediments can become anoxic, and so I'd presume that H2S would be produced. But it probably depends on the pond, depends on how much organic matter and so forth. But I'm not that aware of it being a major issue in ponds around here.
Okay, well, good, thanks. Are there any other questions for Andrea?
Andrea, one last question. There is a foundation in the US called the George Bowley's Foundation, and they recently launched a call for the best idea to fix the phosphorus problems in water. And the prize, who will be announced in 2020, is $10 million.
Wow.
Are you going with your colleagues who gathered all the information possible on wetlands and propose that potentially wetland could contribute significantly to nutrient reductions in our waters?
Yeah, but it may require a lot of land area to convert. Like,
yes.
It depends on how much phosphorus there is. But I know that there's a lot of kind of from the biotech side of things with immobilized alginate beads and so forth. That there's probably more efficient ways that probably require a lot more technology than, because if you use natural systems, I'm afraid you probably have to use very large areas to process the water.
But maybe more sustainable for the long term. I would say the natural system, it's for life.
True. True. Yeah. That's true.
Thank you, Andrea.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Andrea, for a very interesting talk. I hope you enjoyed the experience as well. Thanks, everyone, for your attention. Our next speaker is Jennifer Barrow from McGill. Jennifer is a grad student, and her talk will be scheduled very soon. If you are also interested in giving a talk, do not hesitate to contact us at Limno Seminar. You can also contact me directly. I'm Alex at the University of Ottawa, and you can find all the contact info on the Society for Canadian Limnologists website. Thanks for your attention, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.